Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping right into Raymond Aron's brilliant and honestly pretty complex framework on morality, power, and strategy on the global stage. Have you ever looked at a major global conflict and thought, how on earth do leaders actually justify doing this? Or maybe you've wondered why international law sometimes feels, well, completely powerless. If so, you are definitely in the right place. We're zeroing in on the praxeology section of Aron's masterwork, Peace and War. Basically, we're going to explore the deep contradictions, the massive antinomies of how diplomacy and strategy actually play out in the real world. Let's get into it. So to kick things off, we have to tackle a central question that sets up the giant paradox at the very heart of international relations. In a world without universal law, what exactly is moral behavior? Just think about it for a second. Inside a country, citizens obey laws and the police enforce them. It's structured. But on the world stage, there's absolutely no supreme police force. There's no ultimate umpire to call the fouls. So how do nations decide what's right and wrong when their actual survival is constantly on the line?
Section 1. The Paradox of State Relations. To really understand how nations act, we first need to look at the pretty unstable foundation of how these political units interact with one another.
Here's the absolute crux of the paradox. States interact almost like a regular society, right? They trade with each other, they negotiate treaties, they send ambassadors back and forth. But, and this is a huge but, they permanently reserve the right to use violence to solve their disputes. They acknowledge each other's humanity, sure, but the ultimate shadow hovering over literally every decision they make is the risk of war. In international politics, a state is the sole judge of its own honor and its own vital interests.
This brings us to a really raw historical reality. The French socialist P.J. Prudence once asked something super provocative. He said, "What is the evidence of citizens dropping their votes in a ballot box against that of soldiers spilling their blood?" Wow, it's a harsh truth. But international law is ultimately based on force. Because if you think about it, without force, the states making those laws wouldn't even exist in the first place. For thousands of years, states and entire empires have been born and have died in and by war.
Moving on to Section 2, the illusion of idealism. So if force is such a grim, heavy reality, you might be wondering, why can't we just rely on international law to mandate peace? Like, why not just make war illegal and call it a day? Well, as it turns out, a lot of people have tried exactly that. And this brings us to what Aron brilliantly calls the illusion of idealism.
Just look at this timeline showing the idealistic attempts between the world wars to prevent conflict without actually backing it up with military force. Take 1928, for example. The Kellogg-Briand Pact literally tried to outlaw war as an instrument of national policy. Sounds great, right? But as history marched on toward 1933 and 1936, we quickly saw that a treaty without any teeth is just a piece of paper. When Hitler rose to power and remilitarized the Rhineland, the democracies just stood by. They were totally paralyzed by this devotion to peace, which, ironically, guaranteed an infinitely deadlier war down the road. When nations rely on wishful thinking instead of actual mechanisms for enforcement, their legal frameworks inevitably just collapse. This is what we call legal idealism. It's basically the belief that abstract rules can govern the whole world without any global sheriffs or armed force to back them up. I mean, outlawing war by treaty. It's kind of like a doctor trying to cure a deadly disease simply by declaring it contrary to human aspirations. It completely ignores the cold, hard reality that in international relations, the right of force has historically won out.
That brings us to Section 3, the reality of power politics. This massive failure of idealism swings the pendulum completely to the opposite extreme, into the harsh, unyielding realm of realism. If idealism is just a dangerous illusion, what does a brutally honest, no-holds-barred view of global politics actually look like?
Well, check out this stark dichotomy between two very different types of realism. On one side, you've got this 19th century German concept of Machtpolitik, heavily championed by historians like Treschke. They literally saw power politics as a divine calling. To them, war was this holy ordeal that brought out heroism and tested the true cultural worth of a nation. Wild, right? But then on the flip side, you have modern American realism from folks like Niebuhr and Morgenthau. They look at power politics not with pride, but with a sort of tragic resignation. They see the struggle for power as just an unavoidable byproduct of human imperfection, and frankly, the desperate need to survive in a completely anarchic world.
But here's the catch. Diplomats like George F. Cannon realize that pure cynicism isn't really the answer either.
He famously noted that we need to be gardeners, not mechanics, in our approach to world affairs. Managing global anarchy requires careful adaptive tending. You can't just apply rigid formulas, you can't build some perfect machine to churn out world peace, and you definitely shouldn't glorify violence. Instead, you have to evaluate every single situation on its own, carefully balancing historical equity with the actual, on-the-ground realities of power.
Section 4. The morality of prudence. So how do we navigate this? Aron essentially synthesizes these two extremes into one singular stabilizing concept. He completely rejects the fanaticism of the idealist, the person who strictly divides the world into pure good and pure evil. But he also rejects the deeply cynical realist who acts like humans are nothing more than beasts of prey.
And this brings us to Aron's ultimate takeaway, the morality of prudence. A statesman has to evaluate each specific situation neutrally, prioritizing the limitation of violence over some rigid pursuit of absolute justice. Basically, prudence is the absolute highest virtue in foreign policy. Think about it. If you try to play the angel and push for absolute justice no matter what, you might end up waging a total, uncompromising war that just destroys everything. But if you play the beast and ignore all moral obligations, well, you destroy the very fabric of civilization itself. Prudence is all about acting with a modest, grounded awareness of the limits of your own power and knowledge.
Which leads us to Section 5, War in the Atomic Age. Now, everything we've talked about so far makes total sense in a world of conventional armies. But we really have to ask ourselves, does this carefully constructed morality actually survive the apocalyptic, literally world-ending scale of thermonuclear weapons? I mean, what happens to prudence when humanity unlocks the power to entirely extinguish itself?
To unpack this, Aron outlines 6 theoretical types of thermonuclear bombing. He takes this dense, philosophical nightmare and turns it into a clear menu of strategic choices. And look at how warfare completely fragments here. The first 3 options, terrorizing a city, limited reprisals, or strictly targeting enemy weapons, they're brutal, for sure, but they still kind of operate under the old-school logic of trying to force your enemy to surrender. But those bottom 3, executing a desperate threat, a totally unlimited free-for-all, or outright extermination, that is a complete break from historical rationality. At that point, you're not talking about strategy anymore. You're talking about pure vengeance, homicidal madness, or just absolute absurdity.
The moral nature of warfare just transforms entirely here. Why? Because the sheer, unfathomable scale of explosive power makes any traditional limitations almost impossible to maintain. We aren't just dealing with a bigger bomb anymore. A massive shift in quantity, going from thousands of tons of TNT to millions of tons, creates a genuinely terrifying qualitative leap. If things escalate, it's no longer a question of which army wins the battle. It's literally about whether society itself is going to survive the week.
And to anchor this terrifying abstraction in cold, hard data, strategic thinkers like Herman Kahn actually had to sit down and calculate the unthinkable. Kahn pointed out that a massive radiation exposure of 250 Roentgens would increase seriously defective human births by 25% above the normal rate. And that's for generations to come. It's wild to think that modern statesmen might actually find themselves doing this horrifying math in real time, having to decide if defending an ally is actually worth fundamentally altering the genetic heritage of the entire human race.
Faced with that kind of horrifying genetic damage and potential annihilation, philosophers like Bertrand Russell argued that humanity is basically left with just 3 absolute extremes. 1, we completely destroy ourselves. 2, we survive, but we bomb the population catastrophically back to the Stone Age. Or 3, we surrender all national sovereignty to a single global government with a monopoly on force. But, as Aron rightly points out, even these absolute extremes don't actually give us a practical policy for today. Right now, we still have to navigate the present day using deterrence, playing what is essentially a terrifying, high-stakes game of global chicken.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really profound thought to chew on. It highlights the ultimate gravity of statecraft in our incredibly fragile world. If war can no longer act as a rational tool to create balance without risking the literal end of the human story, then what exactly is the future of international relations? Can this morality of prudence actually save us from the terrifying logic of our own inventions? It's a heavy question, but it's one that every citizen and definitely every statesman has to keep asking. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into Aron's brilliant and very sobering work. Catch you next time.